Hey, like, share, and subscribe. On August the 9th, 2020, the wrestling community was saddened to hear that James Harris, who wrestled as Kamala, the Ugandan Giant, had passed away at age 70. Kamala had a history of diabetes and high blood pressure that left him a double amputee. And this video will be a cursory glance at Kamala's career and some thoughts about the character. James Harris was born May 28th, 1950 in Senatobia, Mississippi. His father died when he was young, and so during his early years, he was involved in a lot of crime, specifically burglaries and breaking and enterings. And at age 17, he was arrested several times for breaking and entering. And he was able to turn his life around, and he became a truck driver in 1970, which he was about the age of 20. When he turned 28, he began wrestling as a Sugar Bear Harris. He was a journeyman wrestler, not particularly in demand, not particularly any good, but this is pretty much when his wrestling career began. He traveled throughout some small territories, and he went over to Europe. And in Europe is where he claimed initially that he began planting the seeds for Kamala when he became the Mississippi Mauler. And when he came to Memphis in 1982 and he met Jerry Lawler, this is kind of where conflicting reports began to take place, because in some reports, he claims to have completely created Kamala, and all Jerry Lawler did was draw the moon and the stars. And in some other reports, he just said that Jerry Lawler created the character completely. But ultimately, the point of Kamala was that Kamala, the Ugandan Giant, was an attempt to take somebody who was not particularly a good wrestler and to cover them with a gimmick in order to make them more interesting. And James Harris really loved the idea, and he ran with it. And Kamala, with his natural size, he was 6'7", over 300 pounds. And the striking appearance of Kamala as the giant, barefoot African savage, it really worked. And he became a huge star in Memphis, and he was able to take that and become a main event act everywhere that he went. So Kamala made one of his biggest impacts in pro wrestling in Mid-South Wrestling when he was brought there in 1982, 1983 by Bill Watts. In this area, he feuded with the top guy, which was the Junkyard Dog. We also got into a feud with Andre the Giant, in which he bloodied Andre the Giant and body slammed him, which led to a series of record-selling matches between Kamala and Andre. And this sort of cemented Kamala as a top guy anywhere in the country. He was able to travel to Texas, which was another big territory, wrestle for the Von Erichs at world class. And eventually he made his way up to New York City, where he, reached sort of the highlight of his career, and that he had a 6-month feud with Hulk Hogan in 1986 for the WWF Championship. Unfortunately, Kamala and the WWF, particularly Vince McMahon, had several financial issues, and Kamala did not want to stay on, so he left. And he kind of middled around wrestling until 1992, when he came back to the WWF to have a feud with the Ultimate Warrior, and then he had a feud with The Undertaker, which led to, in 1992. So, this led to the very first televised casket match between Kamala and The Undertaker at Survivor Series. Once again, Kamala and the WWF will have financial disputes, and Kamala will leave the WWF. Back when he worked for Bill Watts, Kamala had purchased an 18-wheeler truck, and he had began truck driving again in between his wrestling gigs. So from 1992 until present day, to his passing, he drove a truck until he lost his legs. And I think it was 2011 when he lost his legs. He would make the occasional appearance for the WWF. He made the WrestleMania 17, the gimmick battle royal. He made an appearance on the episode of Raw, or was it SmackDown, when he faced Umaga, a similar character from Samoa. And he just generally sort of started to fade into obscurity as his financial situation with the WWF was pretty much routine. He constantly said that he was not paid correctly for things like royalties. And he was actually in the middle of a lawsuit, I believe, with the WWF, which is why he was never introduced into the WWE Hall of Fame. But whether that gets cleared up or not, Kamala is still one of the most impactful pro wrestlers in history, and he will be sorely missed. Now, the first time I would have seen Kamala would have been in 1992. I would have been 7 years old. So I didn't really understand the character as I saw it. But, when you see something like that for the first time, you're like, oh my goodness. it is, you get that initial reaction, and you're not really sure where to go with where it's going or where you go with it. But, he was a wrestler like every wrestler to me. It was, but he was huge, and he had the face paint, and I was just kind of like, wow. It was at this point in time, though, there was more than one big black dude with face paint on his face. I'm pretty sure Kamala and Papa Shango existed at the same time, so it was really kind of hard to tell the difference between the two if you were a kid. As an adult, of course, you kind of learn the difference. But but it was interesting to see that kind of character not being really played up for laughs, but being played as serious. But as I grew up, of course, I went back and I watched his run in Mid-South Wrestling when he wrestled, the Junkyard Dog and Andre the Giant. And my favorite Kamala memory is not even a match, or it's not even when he body slammed Andre the Giant, because he just did it so effortlessly. What my favorite moment is actually his introduction into Mid-South Wrestling. If you see Kamala, he's coming to the ring. They're playing this African drum music or whatever for his entrance, and he's got his handler. They call him Friday. In Mid-South, they call him Kimchi in the WWF. He's coming to the ring, and he's got all these accoutrements on him. Like, he's got this like straw on him, and he's got like all type of things, but he got this like wooden mask on his face. And the people in the Irish McNeil Boys Club, which is where Mid-South Wrestling used to tape their shows, they had no idea what to make of Kamala. They're like, this gigantic black dude. They have no idea what's going on. And then they take the wooden mask off, and there's this air of both fear and amazement. And I was just like, wow. Like, that's sort of the good stuff about wrestling, when you see that people actually buy in, and people are like, oh my goodness, this is, something different. It's striking, it's, and then of course his style, which he was not very technically sound as it is. So his style fit the character in that he just punched and kicked and did big body slams and body splashes and stuff like that. So he wrestled a very rudimentary style, but it actually fit the character, because he was actually able to do that stuff very well. As Sugar Bear Harris, he wasn't a technical savage, let's put it like that. But as Kamala, he didn't have to be. He was able to work the character, and the character was to be a inaudible, violent savage, put it like that. So the character of Kamala is very controversial. A lot of people are offended by it and say, oh, it would never work today. And I just want to give some thoughts about that. One, the character of Kamala is sort of accurate if you look at African societies. So as a person who is comfortable with Africa and African societies, especially ancient African societies, or African societies prior to, well, even, I guess you would say during colonialism, because there's no like pictures of African societies prior to colonialism. But if you're perfectly fine with, looking at tribes of Africa dance and do all their tribal stuff, which they are not ashamed of doing, then I don't understand why Kamala would be offensive. But I do understand also that Kamala as a character was supposed to be the bodyguard of Idi Amin, the butcher of Uganda, the murderous president and dictator of Uganda, in a modern society. So the idea that, Idi Amin was the leader of Uganda in the 1960s, early 1980s, and his bodyguard would be a barefoot tribesman, that doesn't make any sense. So I will agree with anybody who says like, well, the character is out of date. I agree with that part, but I believe that the storyline of the character being the bodyguard of Idi Amin did not leave Memphis when it was created. So as people saw it in different places, it was not presented in the same way. It was just sort of presented as a African tribesman who was brought in to be a wrestler, and he wrestled like an African tribesman. So James Harris, the guy who actually played Kamala, loved the character. There was again there were some conflicting reports about whether how to what degree he had input into the creation of Kamala. In some interviews, he says that he actually started planting the seeds for Kamala in Europe, and that Jerry Lawler just kind of told him to go with it and then helped him. And in other interviews, he says he came to Memphis and then Jerry Lawler kind of slapped his gimmick on him because he had nothing, he had nothing else for him. So it depends on, which interview you read. Who knows what the hell the truth is as far as Jerry Lawler's input into the Kamala character. But, the bottom line was Jerry Lawler was involved in this. So for years, a lot of people thought that Vince McMahon created Kamala. It's like, no, Vince McMahon created Saba Simba, which is actually worse. So, no, Vince McMahon did not create Kamala. But another thing is that James Harris seemed to have really loved playing Kamala. He really enjoyed the character. He really enjoyed the gimmick. He took it seriously. He didn't play it up for laughs, even though, in the WWF, things have to be a little bit more cartoonish because it's for a younger audience, especially in the early 90s, which is kind of like modern day, where WWF was mostly for children back then. It was played up. That's, a little bit. It was still not to be mocked, but it was a little bit more childish than it was in Mid-South and in World Class, when he was presented as a towering beast who just beat the shit out of everybody. And the fact that he wore face paint and was barefoot was kind of incidental. Like he could have been wearing boots and he could have been doing anything at that point. So as somebody who is comfortable with Africa and Africanism and Africans being African, and if you just watch any Africans, they'll do whatever it is they do with pride. They have pride in their culture. They have pride in their tribes. And that's kind of how I looked at Kamala. I looked at James Harris as a guy who took pride in his Africanism and being a black man. And he just decided, hey, I can use this, not mock it, but use it to, make myself more interesting. And that's what he did. And it ended up being one of the best gimmicks in the history of the business. It drew a lot of money. Unfortunately, I have no idea where that money went because he kind of, had started having financial troubles as he got older. But hopefully the financial situations and the royalties and everything with the the WWE rather, can get cleared up and Kamala can take his rightful place as a WWE Hall of Famer. If not, then, he'll just have to live on in the hearts and minds of wrestling fans all over the world. Thank you for listening to this video. Like, share, and subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later.